Hello, and welcome to the Canadian Story, where we discuss what Canada is, what Canada could be, and what Canada should be.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Canadian Story. Thank you for being here. Today, we are joined for the second time by Dr. Julie Ponesse. Dr. Ponesse, thanks so much for coming back and talking to us.
Very happy to chat with you today. Always, but today also.
Well, thank you very much. So this is your second time here, but for the people who didn't hear your first episode, why don't you just give a brief background on your story and who you are, and I guess kind of why you're here?
Yeah, it's so funny because, I've probably given this explanation. I don't know. It probably has been over 100 times or something. So every time I go to do it, I think, I give the abridged version because everybody's heard it. But if I do that and people haven't heard it, it doesn't make any sense. So I'll give the very, very basic strokes, and then you can tell me what detail needs to get filled in. So I used to be an ethics professor. I taught at Huron College, which is an affiliate college at Western University in London, Ontario, Canada. And I challenged and ultimately refused to comply with the COVID vaccine mandate last August and was terminated with cause in a very public way. I released a video about the situation and it ended up going viral, and that was sort of involved in the termination. And then I got picked up by the Democracy Fund as their ethics scholar, and I've been working on issues to do with civil liberties, not just COVID, but the other crises that we're facing in the country in terms of free speech and the right to raise our children as we want and educate our children as we want, and the right to travel, to move, to protest, all these things that really are antithetical to statism, right? So to this idea that we should turn over governance of all spheres of our life to the state. And I think that's really the tension that we're facing today. So civil liberties organizations like the Democracy Fund try to show why that might be a mistake and what we can do to protect our liberties on pain of potentially losing them forever.
Right. Okay. That's great. We have talked extensively on this podcast about COVID, and sometimes I feel like COVID episodes are becoming a broken record. So I'm really excited about I don't want to avoid talking about COVID, but I'm really excited about the other work that's being done by the Democracy Fund. So why don't we start with free speech then? How do you feel like free speech is being challenged in our country right now, and why is it important to protect that right?
Well, so I think you're quite right that we have been a bit myopically focused on COVID as the crisis of our time. And in some sense it is, but I think it's really just a punctuated symptom of a much deeper problem. And it's sort of opened up this wound into society that's showing what's really wrong with us. And I mentioned earlier that we have this problem, I think. Some don't see it as a problem, some see it as a virtue, but where we've decided that we aren't going to worry about how to live our lives anymore because the government will take care of that for us, right? You don't have to worry about being sick because we've got free healthcare for that. You don't have to worry about taking care of your aging parents because we have long-term care for that. You don't even have to worry about what to say, on the topic of free speech, because why would you need to worry about what to say in a state in which dialogue and discussion and rights and the right to speak don't matter anymore? So free speech is really, I think we saw the COVID, I know I'm jumping around here a little bit, but it's such a complicated, intricately woven issue. I think we saw over the last 2 years that this COVID war, if you want to call it that, between two different narratives was fought with the ammunition of language that disparaged people on both sides. But I think the pro-narrative soldiers kind of formed their narrative linguistic tools first, right? So terms like COVIDiot and I don't know if you remember Coronaburo, which was this sort of derogatory term. It's more common in Spain, I think in Europe, but it was basically a derogatory term for people who were acting ignorant like a donkey would, being ignorant of the importance of public health measures, things like that. Okay. So we're seeing kind of, I think, this language war fought in two different ways. One is stripping our rights to free speech, and the other is building up a system of language that creates a new kind of social structure. And at the Democracy Fund, we think that, the right to speak is in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms for a reason. And I have said before, and I think about this a lot, and it's a hypothesis I'm currently holding. I'm always open to being challenged, but I think free speech is quite possibly the most important of our protected rights in Canada, because it's the one that allows us to work to protect all the other ones. Right. And we also know the extent to which the words that we use not only reflect our thinking, but help to mold our thinking. So there are something like more than 7,000 languages in the world. And those languages don't just have identical substitutable words for different objects and ideas. So it's not like every language in the world has a word for book, or every language in the world has a word for apple and only one word for apple. We know kind of the standard example in philosophy of language is that the native peoples in the north have many, many words for snow, because that's their experience, because they live in it. And so it makes sense to try to reflect it in all of its diverse ways. And so when it comes to concepts that protect our freedom, like autonomy and consent and choice, it's not surprising, I think, that we're seeing the COVID war fought over the use of those terms, because if we allow those terms to be used freely, it impacts how people think about themselves and what they're entitled to. And it's been a horrific 2 years in some sense, but it's been a very interesting 2 years, because when I started working on all of this a couple of years ago, I assumed as a first principle that everyone would want to be autonomous, that we would want to rule our own lives, that we would want to be able to speak when we have ideas, when we think it's important to defend what we care about. It's turned out that isn't true for many of us, maybe even most of us. And I think the reason that isn't true for us anymore is because we've been told a story according to which there's an easier path to life. We just outsource our thinking. We turn over all that matters to us, our health, our political choices. I put choice in scare quotes because, again, we're kind of being told that we shouldn't have those choices anymore. The right to express ourselves, the right to certain kinds of jobs, the right to stay in school, the right to travel. These things are outsourced to a supposed expert that is owned by the state and that will tell us how to live our lives. So in some sense, there's something very intoxicating about that in a world where we feel overwhelmed, bombarded with information, no idea. We're just worn down, I think, right? And the people who are challenging all of this, resisting all of this, saying, I would rather have freedom than safety, I'm not willing to buy what you're offering anymore, are in the minority, but they see very clearly for themselves that no amount of guaranteed protection or safety or purity or health or ease of life or luxury or any kind of guarantee that comes from another entity, including the state, is worth what you can create for yourself if you're allowed to live freely. I felt like I went on for about 29 minutes there. I don't even remember what the original question was.
Well, no, there's a lot to unpack there. Why don't we start
This is what happens if you ask a philosopher one question.
What do you think emotionally and psychologically drives individuals to a preference of outsourcing and handing over that decision-making process to other people, and what psychologically and emotionally drives the people who don't want to do that? What is the difference between those two people?
Goodness, if I knew that, we would just be out of that. I think there's no doubt that there is a big difference, right? I have a little anecdote to share. It's a story I heard from someone a few days ago. And he was talking to someone in his church, I think, who this would be in December 2020. So just before the second lockdown came along, I think. And she said, I just wish the government would hurry up and decide what they're going to do, lock us down or not, because then we don't have to figure it out ourselves. We don't have to figure it out. We don't have to worry about it, whether I'm inviting this aunt to Christmas or not. I just wish they'd make the decision for us. I don't, when I think back on all the history that I've read, that isn't the powerful human narrative, unless I'm missing something obvious, right? The human tendency, I thought, was to be a little bit maybe wanton and reckless in exchange for being able to make decisions for oneself. But right now we are seeing, I think, the majority of people express a view like that woman expressed, which is things would be a lot easier if you just told me what to do. Please just tell me what you want me to do. Mm-hmm. And whether that comes from being overwhelmed and bombarded, like I said, I mean, we're in this, I think when the internet came along, and I'm going to sound like such an old fogey when I say this, but I remember distinctly, I can't tell you the date, but the phenomenology of the experience, I remember the day that internet came into the classroom when I was a professor at Western. And everything changed in a heartbeat. That focus, that interest, the students on what they were doing in that room shifted to something outside of it. And it's never come back. And I don't think it will ever come back until we learn how to control technology in our lives. So whether or not we're just overwhelmed and bombarded by a kind of technological explosion that is outpacing our ability to manage it, and it's almost causing, I mean, I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, as you well know, but it almost looks to me like it's causing a kind of post-traumatic stress that we are trying to cope with the residual effects of this intrusion into our lives that we never really asked for, because it's a sort of ability or luxury that we didn't even know existed, right? And now it's come along and says, here I am, I'm here to make your life easier, supposedly. And I don't know if you ask many people if their lives have been made easier over the last 20 years. I don't know what they would say. I don't think many would say clearly that it has. So whether it's that, also I've been a very interested follower of Matthias Desmetz, and he, as many of your viewers probably know, has a lot of interesting things about the psychology of totalitarianism and how we've seen that kind of rise and then decline and rise and decline. It's not a new phenomenon. We've seen it in various parts of the world, really over the course of human history, but we've never maybe seen it on a global scale. So when he and people like Robert Malone talk about mass formation psychology, it's not, or mass formation psychosis, it's, again, the internet and globalism have made it so much more possible, not just for us to exchange information with each other, but to feed off the sentiments and the ideas and the behaviors of others almost instantaneously around the world, right? So when we hear or see the kind of virtue signaling practices of people on the internet, on social media, it's pretty quick and easy to adopt those into our own lives and just say, well, everybody else seems to be saying we should follow the rules. Everybody else seems to be going with the flow, so maybe I should do that. And then thirdly, I can't help but come back to this idea that we are, as advanced as we like to claim we are, as far removed as we are from literally living in tribes, that our tribal instincts, our animalistic instincts to protect the herd, are alive and well. And that for many people, for most, they would far rather preserve that security, almost that anonymity in the group, than to become conspicuous and to stand outside of it. And there's a lot of really interesting, psychological literature and studies on this, like the Milgram experiment and mob psychology, and why you can have, a woman raped in the streets, and the bystander effect is so powerful, and why people will just stand there and watch if they see nobody else doing anything about it, Or is it a combination of all of those things or something entirely different? I don't know. It's, people often have said to me over the last year or so, they're like, well, why are you so brave? What's so unique? Maybe I said this to you last time we talked. And I'll say, well, I'm not, I don't think. Fear is a powerful motivator in my life. I'm just so much more afraid of what will happen if we don't speak out, even on pain of becoming conspicuous now. Because, right or wrong, I feel like we are on a downward slope towards repeating some of the worst atrocities in history. I don't think we are at the end of, I don't think that being outside now, or maybe we're emerging from the COVID crisis, I don't think that puts us at the end of this chapter. I don't know where we are in the chapter or in the novel, or however you want to sort of structure the metaphor, but I think we are, things could get so much worse. And that fear, and maybe that alone, is what makes me anyway, and maybe you and maybe a lot of other people who are challenging all of this, continue to do so, even though they are suffering in terrible ways, even though it's cost them a lot, even though it will continue to cost them a lot.
Mm-hmm. So do you think it is the advent of the internet that has globalized this particular totalitarian bent? Because we've seen totalitarianism practiced many times throughout history, but never, it seems to me, to have been practiced on such a global scale. Do you attribute that to our interconnectivity?
Well, I guess one question is, could you have globalism without the internet?
I mean,
Would that be possible?
I guess not. I think it would be very,
I
very,
think
very
you
hard.
yeah. So if you didn't, I think you would need another vehicle because what is globalism anyway? I mean, there's a kind of a cadence to the exchange of information, right? Say 1,000 years ago, information was able to travel around the world, but at a snail's pace, because it had to do so via letters and people on ships, and then 100 years ago on trains and boats and telegraphs and on all of these things. So I think that it's the expediency of information travel that the internet has facilitated, that has made what we call globalism possible. And globalism, right? The idea that we are somehow living the experience as a global people and not just as local people, as village people, or friend groups or family groups or city groups. So I think the globalism as we're experiencing it now would not be possible without the internet or some facsimile of it. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If we had the internet but no social media, would that make a difference?
Yeah, I think
know. Would it be better or worse? Right? I mean, you might argue that it'd be better because then you wouldn't have all this kind of proliferation of what's going on, but it might be worse because it's really only in social media where we've been able to see some counter narrative structure emerging, and then podcast platforms and some independent media, right?
Yeah, who's to say that we would be better off? I like to think that we would, but you're right. The only real place we've gotten coherent opposition, or at least the ability to ask questions, have been on social media. That's where you go to get that information. It's not available within Canada on CTV or CBC or any of those platforms. It's not broadcast from there. You have to go to social media to find it. So it's this weird double-edged sword that is, I think, on one hand, so toxic, and on another hand, at the exact same time, one of the only things that's giving us the opportunity to fight back. It's this weird dichotomy that's really uncomfortable to me.
Yeah, double-edged sword, as you put it, a necessary evil. It's right. I don't think, if you think, could the truck convoy have gotten organized without social media?
I don't think so. It certainly wouldn't have been. It certainly, well, here we can take it this way. It certainly wouldn't have been nearly as successful or large without social media, because whether or not the organizers of that convoy could have organized without social media is one question. But the more important question is, would people have known about it in the same way if social media didn't exist? And they wouldn't have, because again, it was so slandered in the mainstream, and it was so brought down and talked down on, and shrunk in mainstream media. So it wouldn't have had the impact that it did. And I think that particular event is perhaps the most important event Canada has seen. Well, I'm 30 years old. At the very least in my lifetime, I think that is the most important thing that has happened in Canada. And it wouldn't have happened without social media, I don't think. So as much as I like to berate social media, it's kind of in a weird, uncomfortable way also our savior.
Well, in a world where mainstream media outlets, and without even talking about what's going on behind the scenes to create this effect, but in a world where mainstream media outlets seem to report, and I use that word loosely, but in lockstep with one another, where there seems to be no kind of dissonance, no disagreement, no counter evidence and no transparency of the the data and the facts, so that readers and viewers can make their own minds, right? In a world like that, some other way of sharing information seems to need to be possible. And I don't want to say that social media or that the internet is inherently bad, but it might just be the case that it happened at a pace that our skills were unprepared to cope with.
Mm-hmm.
And that in our sort of eagerness to use it, the fun, the dopamine hits we get from doing so. I mean, there's all kinds of interesting research about why we can't put our phones down, right? That it became an addiction, and addictions have very often harmful effects. They can lead to domestic abuse or reckless spending of money or car accidents or abusive language, whatever it is, right? And I think the internet itself as an addiction has caused harms in our lives, and that we are living through and coping with. And the thing we hope for is that this will be a stepping stone, a learning experience that will figure out how to give it its proper place in our lives and not allow it to act as a surrogate for our own critical thinking. And I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, I think humans have a bad habit of innovating ahead of their ability to self-control. I think we come up with new ideas and new technologies and new things and overuse them before we kind of get a handle on what we're actually doing, and I guess before we learn how to use them responsibly. And I the best example of that would be social media right now, because it is an addiction, and it's a deep addiction for so many people. And the data points are clear that it makes people's emotional well-being who are addicted to it much, much worse, particularly young women. I can't remember where I read this, but I read a study that was done where there was a direct correspondence to what they were calling emotional health and the amount of followers these young women had on social media. And it was the polar opposite of what you would expect, because the idea is that you want to have more, you want to have a bigger network, you want to be more popular. But what the study found is that the more social influence these young women had, the less happy they were, which is terrifying, because we don't yet have a metric, or not a metric, we don't yet have a mechanism to control that, in the same way that we would have a mechanism that says you aren't allowed to buy cigarettes until you're of a certain age. We don't have any, and believe me, I'm not a fan of regulation, but I'm concerned about the effect that the internet is having on an entire generation of young people right now.
Well, it might be the case that what you're worried about is external regulation, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be working on regulating ourselves, right? That's
Absolutely.
what, I mean, when you think about autonomy comes from two Greek words that means a kind of self-rule or self-regulation. And I think that's what we've forgotten. We sort of think that, well, either maybe we're making a conscious thought that the internet is good and therefore any presence it has in our lives will necessarily make our lives better. Or I think what's more likely is we just aren't thinking about it. It's there, it's easy, it's addictive, it's relatively inexpensive form of entertainment, I suppose. Although I don't know, I hate to think what people are spending on all their Black Friday sales. I keep getting ads for all these things. And I'm not sure how inexpensive a hobby it is, but we really, I have a sort of a thought in my head. It's hard to get out and package it because it takes us to history and it takes us to psychology. And if you think about what social media does, it's really a way to increase one's perceived or desired reputation, right? It's a way to promote oneself, to feel good about oneself, to get the response of others, right? And so this is why celebrity is desired. This is why we want to be in the in group in high school, why we want popularity. I mean, it feels good, or so we think, to be valued by other people, to be thought well of. And even if being thought well of is just a matter of getting another little heart on something, a little like or whatever it is. But we know, I mean, one of my areas of specialization is ancient philosophy. You go back to people like Plato and Aristotle. They wrote about this even 2000 plus years ago, about reputation and honor and why the good life should never consist in those things. And there are a lot of differences between Plato and Aristotle on this point. But I think one thing they agree about is that reputation is an external good. It's something you can't control ultimately. It's up to other people to do to you or do for you, right? Why would you ever want your life, whether or not your life is going well, whether you're happy, why would you ever want that to rest on what someone else does? The most important thing, your life going well, should rest on something you have control over. So that's why they say it's much more important that you rest happiness on internal goods. And internal goods are things like intellectual virtues like the pursuit of truth and honesty and curiosity, and moral virtues like generosity and courage and temperance and things like that, right? And it sounds, again, very kind of old fogey and not keeping up with the times. But I think the age-old lesson is that becoming a good person, becoming balanced and courageous and aware of oneself and aware of what you need to do when the situation calls for it, is going to make you so much more whole. It's going to give you so much more integrity. And if you have that kind of integrity, you will be happier as a byproduct. If we just pursue happiness, especially through the route of getting the approval of other people, it's paradoxical. It's not possible. Right. And so it's not surprising that it falls apart and that people are reporting, we've got children's mental health crises, we've got mental health epidemics, we have opioid epidemics. It's not surprising that I think Canada just fell, I haven't read it for a few months now, but we fell to an abysmal number on the World Happiness Index, right?
Right.
We're not doing very well. So maybe we should change the rules or change the game we're playing.
Yeah, you say it sounds old-timey or old folky, but there's a reason why those particular virtues are the virtues that have emerged out of history and remain with us today, because they must have some use to have stood the test of time. And forgetting them would be foolish, let's say. And I love your explanation of where people are placing their source of happiness, and reputation being an external factor that you can't control because it comes from other people. You don't define your own reputation. Your reputation is defined by the definitions of everyone around you. And that's not a good thing to chase, because you will always be disappointed.
It's always shifting, for one thing. So you work on, this is what the world wants. Okay, I make myself that. Oh, now they want this. I mean, this is what you see.
It feels like that definition of what the world wants is changing faster than anyone can keep up with. And you see that in cancellation, because when cancellation really started being ramped up, it didn't take long for a few sober voices to say, wait a minute, hold on, this is going to come for everyone at some point. And you see examples of quote unquote virtuous and progressive thinkers being ridiculed and quote unquote canceled, who you never would have thought would be a target of that when this first started happening. The most recent example I can think of is Taylor Swift. I don't know if you know what happened with Taylor Swift recently, but she put out a music video, and my opinion of Taylor Swift used to be actually quite high, but I more recently have found her at least the way she thinks, not of taste for me. But she put out a new record recently, and she put out this really, really well done, really creative video about her own struggle with her, her inner demons, right? And in one scene in this video, she steps on a scale, and then the camera shoots down at the scale, and the scale just reads fat. And she got in an unbelievable amount of trouble for that because she was, I guess, not being a part of the body positivity movement or whatever terminology they wanted to use. But all of a sudden, her head was on the chopping block, even though she is an incredibly progressive, an individual who I would consider woke. This eventually comes for everyone because you can't be honest in the public eye without eventually, I think, being canceled, which is very problematic for everyone.
I think that's right. I mean, I even wonder the people who are considered to be woke, what a dizzying experience it is, because it's not like, I mean, within my own industry of academia, it's not like there are certain characters who are beyond reproach. Their status would dissolve the moment they say the unwoke thing, just like the Taylor Swift example that you give. So wokeness is a kind of relativism. There is no objective truth. There's other than the fact that you must believe a certain set of ideas, but I'm not sure there's even stability within what those ideas are, even within a kind of social justice. I mean, now it happens to be, a kind of sexual gender revolution and Black, sort of a racial kind of, I won't even say identity or equality because it's, this is complicated, all these issues, right? I kind of hate to gloss them over with simple terms, but these are the one stability within wokeness is that there is no stability.
Yeah. No kidding.
As the ideas of the mob morph, the mob is expected to go with it because they've created it. And individuals who choose to be unmob are cast outside, kind of like almost like centrifugal force, because it moves so quickly that if you get yourself too much to the periphery of that mob, you're just going to be flung out of the system, which is what happens, right?
Yeah, it's scary how quickly the definitions change. Speaking of definitions, I wanted to get your take on this. Something I observed over the course of the pandemic is the power of labeling and language. And we talked a little bit about language, but let's take an example of, let's say, someone who is concerned, like yourself, of taking the COVID-19 vaccine. That is by definition, I'm sure, for most people, a nuanced position. Everyone has different reasons, different ideas. But something that I saw weaponized was terminology. So you take that person and you apply this term, quote unquote, anti-vaxxer, and now you are a despicable thing. What do you think about that? Is that that's, I guess, not a new idea, but I've never seen it exercised in the way that it was exercised during the pandemic. What do you think about that?
It's very interesting. The term anti-vaxxer, I mean, that is really the linguistic scalpel that cut society up at the joints. If you pulled that out of your linguistic toolbox, you meant to be unhuman in its usage. You meant to exterminate the person to whom you apply it. I can't think of another. I mean, the other words that are within that category that are used with that kind of ammunition are things like Nazi or Jew, depending on what side you're on. Whether we've done this in the past, well, I don't know, but this is schoolyard bullying, right? When children call each other names, they do it because I think they're really ill-equipped to communicate their frustrations in other ways. And what we're supposed to teach our children, what we're supposed to learn through the process of education and being raised appropriately and socialization is how to manage our frustrations with other people so that it's possible either to change each other's mind or to maintain our disagreement, but to do so civilly. But children who are 7 years old, who are calling each other, fatso and freckles, or far worse things, I'm sure, these days.
Mm-hmm.
But in the schoolyard, I mean, that's what we're doing as adults. And we're justifying it, and we're making it virtuous, because we're saying, I think, that we've settled all of the, any of that discussion stuff you want to have that would work out our differences and air our competing ideas. We don't need to do any of that, because we've already figured out what the truth is. And I have it and you don't. So I get to call you a name now, because it's the most expedient way of getting you out of the way of what really matters, which is having the life I want, which is being protected, which is feeling safe. You stand in the way of that like a cancerous growth. I have every right to cut you out as quickly as possible and move on. And it's a kind of intentional evolutionary strategy.
Yeah. That
right
there might be one of those root problems that you were talking about at the beginning of the conversation, that COVID manifested as symptoms. The root problem being, I have the truth. What is that? Have you thought about that at all?
It's so interesting, because we were just talking about relativism, right? And so the people who want to say, I have the truth, tend to be the woke people. They tend to be the social activists, the neoliberals, the progressives, whatever you want to call it. But those are also the people who are the relativists. And relativists should be relativistic about truth and say, well, teaching university for a long time, this is what students say. They say, well, there's no truth really, is there? It's just about what I want, or about whether we can come to agreement about things, right? That's really wokeism. And yet at the same time, paradoxically, almost impossibly, we're seeing people of with these ideologies saying, no, there is a truth, and I happen to have it.
Well,
and
it is my truth
strange.
Is the truth, right? It is the my truth thing.
Right. You mean, so they're recognizing that there can be differences.
Well,
so they're still holding on to the relativism.
Yeah, what I'm saying is, you can always have the truth if the truth is my truth. I guess what I'm trying to draw out is the difference between the truth. Like, we have to be able to agree that there are categorically true things, like, I don't know, gravity, or the color of the sky, or basic perception of reality. But the woke movement has manifested this idea of my truth, and it might be different than your truth, but it is my truth, therefore it is real. And I can always have it because it's my own, and that's why I have the truth. I think that's part of the argument, and I guess it can be relative because the truth can always change. But I reject that argument, because I am a believer that there is a higher truth that is actual reality. And there's definitions there that don't necessarily change. Do you understand?
I think I do. It's very interesting, because when you talk about, you're right, I think you're picking up linguistically on what a lot of these people are saying, which is what my truth, and you can't tell me what my experience of being a Black woman is, or whatever it is. But what that speaks to, in philosophy, we often call that phenomenology, right? That there's an experience that each person has that's irreducible, that you really can't communicate to another person, that language is ultimately ill-equipped. Even if we could, put a person in an MRI machine and see exactly what's going on in their brain, and in principle replicate what was going on in someone else's brain, that second person would have a different experience. So that idea that, well, I have my truth, and you can't tell me what it feels like to me. You can't tell me what it's like to go through this experience. I think we've actually used the wrong word there, because my truth is paradoxical in and of itself. There is no your truth. There is just truth. There's your experience of the truth, There's your interpretation of the truth. There's your questions about the truth, but there's no your truth and my truth. So we've kind of gotten, I think, ourselves off track by using that or allowing that or, revering that language in the first place. Do you think?
Yeah. So how do we responsibly and kindly combat those types of thoughts? Something that this podcast is trying to do is, one of the things that we recognize is that really what we're fighting in our country and really all over the world right now is a cultural war of what our society and our culture is going to look like going forward. And what we're trying to do here on this show is preserve some of those moral virtues and be a part of the demographic of people that carry that forward throughout our society and culture into ideally the next generation and generations forward from that. How do we effectively do that in the situation that we are in today?
It's very hard, I think, and I'll say why I think it's so hard. And then maybe we can talk a bit about what can be done. So I think one of the reasons why it's so hard is because when you try to present evidence these days or data, right? Like say you present some bit of data that's counter narrative. So, but what about what the pandemic measures are doing to children who are dying in Africa and India? What about that? The woke person doesn't look at you and say, wow, I still think they're important, but I do see that that's a problem, or I don't know what to, that's not the kind of conversation you'll see. You won't get that kind of traction because you're presenting evidence or information or raising questions that are just outside their focus of attention, to which they don't give any psychological weight. So that's why I think the discussions, we're just not seeing much success. It's kind of like, you're having a discussion with maybe your spouse over, balancing the books and money. And then one of you says, well, do you like chocolate ice cream or not? And you say, well, that doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about, right? I don't attach any psychological weight to that right now. I think it's a little bit like that. So if that's the problem, then the question, I guess, is how do you have a discussion about things that you do both attach psychological weight to? Right?
Yeah. What is the middle ground that we can start on?
Right. What's the middle ground and what are the things that we both care about? So maybe we disagree about whether or not our children should wear masks, but we agree about the fact that we want to protect our children. Maybe we disagree about whether or not the vaccines are helpful for our aging parents, but we agree that we want to respect and honor their lives. This all sounds a bit like, aren't we too far beyond this kind of respectful dialogue? The cynical part of me wants to say, I think we're so morally worn down right now. And those kind of conversations take a lot of mental and moral resources. They take a lot of patience and tolerance and imagination and curiosity and generosity of spirit to hear things that you don't want to hear, that you don't understand. Takes a lot of moral resilience to talk to someone who's probably said horrible things about you over the last year or two. It takes just a lot of these moral resources, but that's what courage is about, right? Courage is about, I think, finding this balance between fear and confidence and being able to rally when you are ultimately worn down. Because if something was required of you when you were feeling great and had all the energy of the world and wasn't that hard, you wouldn't need to be courageous, right? Courage is what you need when all else has failed you, when you're exhausted, you don't know what else to do, and still you keep coming back to the table. And the thing that's hard, I think, is you can't make someone else want to do that. You can't take a woke person and literally shake the sense into them or shake the fear out of them. You can't create interest on the part of another person to want to talk to you, to want to make a relationship work. I think once that desire is there, you've accomplished like half the battle, maybe more so. But for those who do agree that there's something there to talk about, then these are the things I think we have to we have to work on. We have to realize that we might not agree about second order things, we call them, right, in philosophy. So like how to do something, how to protect our children, how to protect our parents. But we might agree about the more fundamental first order things, like the fact that we want to do so. And I think it's the recognition of agreement about those core values that keeps us interested in the other person, that keeps us interested in the relationship, that makes us want to work on it. But I didn't say this 8 or 10 months ago, but when people ask me about relationships now, the first thing I say is that I think we have to recognize which ones are in principle possible to save and not cry over the spilled milk of the ones that are not in principle savable, right?
Yeah. At a certain point, you have to let the chaff blow in the wind and just separate yourself from, I guess, things that can't be saved. You brought up, you said something that I thought was so interesting. You were talking about woke people shake the sense into them. You can't shake the sense into them, and you can't shake the fear out of them. I want to talk about fear, because that has been the driving force of the past 2.5 years. There's I'm sure you probably don't listen to rap music, but there's a rap line that my brother-in-law showed me.
Why would you think that?
you just don't give off that impression, but I am more than willing to be told that I am wrong. But this line is, and I thought
I also have a 2-year-old, so I listen to music. When did this happen? I don't know. Anyway, sorry.
That's okay. The line is, I'm not afraid of a pandemic. I'm afraid of people who panic. And I think something that we need to be working on as a society is how we interact with fear. Because I think you were correct in what you said earlier. I think COVID is the beginning of this next phase of history, if you will, of history in the West, of history globally. There's an obscene amount of instability in what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, in what China is doing, in the possibility of invading Taiwan, in this idea that there might be global food shortages, the cost of energy is rising. We are surrounded and absolutely engulfed by instability. And that is going to create fear. And I don't think we responded to the fear that was associated with the pandemic very well. So how does an individual, because this has to be done on an individual basis, how does an individual navigate fear?
One thing that's not clear to me is whether people realize they're in a state of fear. I think if you asked people to rate their level of comfort and confidence about the future, they'd be probably fairly low. And if you asked them to rate their anxiety or had a third-party assessment of their anxiety by a doctor or something, they'd probably be fairly high. But whether or not most people would say, I live in a state of fear on a daily basis, I don't know. I'm not sure. That'd be interesting to look at. But we do know about fear that it basically puts us, 50 plus years of neuropsychological research have shown this, that it basically puts us into a state of myopia. So myopia is where you can really only see, it's kind of like you put on, blinders or glasses that allow you to see tunnel vision. That's right. And it allows you to uptake only certain kinds of information, only a certain amount of information from the environment around you. And that makes us really easily molded by things like negative framing that comes from the media that focuses on COVID, ICU numbers and case numbers and death numbers, and not on things like, oh, there might be some treatments for COVID, or most people just have, fairly mild symptoms. But it also changes, I think, our moral capacities, things like how we think of ourselves in relation to other people, and it makes us more suspicious of other people. It almost puts us a little bit back into a state of nature rather than in a sophisticated civil society, if that's what we have or ever have had. I don't know, but it makes us more hostile towards outliers and outgroups. It makes us more dehumanizing, more punitive. It also makes us more susceptible to a savior stepping in. So when our transport minister keep saying in the house that, everything we've done over the last 2 years is to keep you safe. People just gobble that up. And it's the fear that does the gobbling, right? Or that makes us susceptible to doing the gobbling. So I think one question is whether or not we're aware that we're in a state of fear. Are we aware of all these different ways it affects not just our intellectual capacities, but our moral capacities and how we think about other people? But if we are able to get to a state of awareness, I mean, that's half the battle, right? You can kind of diagnose a problem and then you're half the way to solving it. So if you can realize the kind of moral panic you're in and that it comes largely from this media and social media generated mass hysteria, it's, there was I'm not going to remember this example well, but I could probably get the article for you. You can link it if you want. But there was this case, I think it was at Air Emirates flight. Was it in the 90s? I forget. And some passengers started to say they were having flu-like symptoms. And then other passengers started to hear this. They said, really? Yeah, I'm feeling a little bit feverish myself, And of course, this spread throughout the plane. And there was this mass hysteria and they had to land the plane. And then when they got to, I think it was New York, they got to, and they realized that none of the passengers actually had the flu. It was just this kind of hysteria. If we can recognize that that's what's going on, we can do more to, I think, check our beliefs, how we arrived at those beliefs, who the messenger was that delivered the content of those beliefs. Who am I relying on? Oh, a social media influencer told me to buy all these COVID test kits.
Mm-hmm.
Or a major news outlet or FDA that's, colluding with the pharmaceutical companies. If you can sort of start to identify where your fear comes from, and you can disable it or cut it out at the knees, and you realize, well, maybe my fear is not so justified. And if it's not so justified, then maybe I don't need to be so hateful towards the people that I thought I was supposed to be afraid of. And then the whole house of cards starts coming down, right? But I mean, that's not the only, I think, fear of COVID isn't the only fear or set of fears that we face these days, right? Because it's also fear of being called out. Maybe we are in the counter narrative camp, but we're terrified of losing our jobs. We're terrified that our family will find out and will hate us, or we won't have friends anymore. And I mean, those are fears too. And those are quite legitimate fears. Those are not so much based in a kind of mass hysteria. Those are based on, concrete examples of what actually happens to people in the world. But I think in those cases, we have to say to ourselves, well, if I speak my mind and do what I think is right, and I lose a friendship on account of it, what would I have been holding on to if I stayed silent? What would the value of that thing have been? And that, I think, failing to be who you are, failing to have integrity for the sake of keeping a relationship is just going to fester and gnaw at you and will make you miserable anyway. So you won't be able to have the happiness that you're preserving the relationship supposedly for.
Okay, here's a question. Let's take a moment and be kindly self-critical. So we in the counter-narrative community looked at the hysteria of COVID and all of the behavior around that and said that was foolish. You're not thinking straight. So what is the quote unquote counter narrative community afraid of? They're afraid of government overreach. They're afraid of medical tyranny. They are afraid of being canceled. Let's self-assess. How justified are those fears, do you think?
Quite. Right. Because these things happen. Right. Whether or not it's the end of the world, if they happen, I think is a different question.
Right.
But if your fear is, so there's two different things here, right? There's a fear that they will happen, and there's a fear that it will be the end of the world if they happen. I would say the first thing is justified. The second thing might not be, right? Does that make sense?
That's a great distinction. Yeah, that's a very, very good distinction.
Yeah. I mean, I remember when I was sort of questioning the COVID policy at Western, two people I knew of had already been fired for doing the same thing, but not in a public way. I just happened to know about them because they I don't know, we somehow got connected. People heard that we were both worried about all of this. And they got fired in exactly the same way with just about the same amount of time. So I knew that challenging it publicly would probably lead to that end. So I was afraid that that would happen in some sense. But I was not afraid of what I would lose if that happened, right?
Mm. Do you feel...
Because I didn't want to continue working as a free-thinking academic, supposedly in an institution that detested that very thing. And it still does to this day, as far as I know.
How do you feel as an individual who has walked through that fear? Because that is something that I see people avoid. They avoid having to directly confront what they are afraid of, which is something that you did. How did that impact you emotionally and psychologically? If that's not too personal of a question to ask.
No, it's fine. In some sense, I think I cheated a little bit because I did it so early on that we hadn't seen yet how much outliers would be hated and vilified. I mean, I had a sense of it, but I mean, this was over a year ago. We didn't have, I mean, the language of vilifying, hating the unvaccinated, the horrible things that Trudeau has said, none of that had happened yet. We hadn't seen the degree to which we would hold on to the hatred, even as the science changed and evidence emerged to suggest that people who were worried about lockdowns and masking and vaccines and all of that probably kind of had a point. We hadn't seen any of that yet. So I had no idea how much I would be vilified and hated, which made it more possible to make that decision. I mean, horrible things, and my colleagues said horrible things. There's this Arthur Kaplan at NYU, very revered bioethics professor who's worked on vaccines for decades, and he said I wouldn't pass her in my class. I mean, and the mainstream media articles in Canada and the Toronto Star, National Post, CBC, they were. If you know that that's what the public response is going to be, I hope I would have made the same decision. I can't ever go back and know, but it would have felt quite different than it did, I think.
That's fair. It has been shocking, especially for me watching. Like, it's one thing to have people on Facebook or Twitter berate you for something that you do. It is an entirely different thing to have the leader of your country mislabel and abuse your feelings and your decisions. To call someone who refuses a vaccine likely racist and misogynist has zero basis whatsoever. The argument is brutally unsupported, and yet that came from the leader of our country. It was just shocking to watch and incredibly disorienting, because it makes you wonder and question about what is actually going on the Hill. Like how does
it's really horrifying. Yeah, it's horrifying. Our leaders, and New Zealand is not doing very well either in that respect in terms of leadership and some other places in the world. But I think what's been really even harder than that is that he got elected again. We said, yeah, that's probably the best we can do. Let's do that again. So our leaders are really a reflection of ourselves, aren't they? We got to this place because, and I use the word majority carefully when we're talking about voting because it's a complicated system, but many, many of us wanted that kind of leadership.
Yeah.
They think that that's what a society, I won't even say civil society anymore. I think that's what society should look like. Right. And you think about people that are often referred to as the great leaders in history, whether you think about Gandhi or Lincoln or Roosevelt or Queen Elizabeth or Churchill or whoever it is, right? Martin Luther King, they're not vilifying people. They have strong views. They probably have great worries about people on the other side of those views. And they probably think we need to be very careful to protect our children from those views, but they aren't haters. They're not vilifiers. And I think they saw their role as leaders as trying to, minimize that sort of acerbic aspect of society and try to find common ground and try to promote things like respect. And now we've just gotten to the point where leaders like Trudeau don't have those virtues at all. He's not apologetic about it. He's unapologetically vilifying. And that has become the new virtue.
Yeah,
And,
that's a scary thought.
But a true one, I think. And we need to get to the point where as citizens, we say, we're not buying what you're selling anymore. That's not the world we want to live in. Whether or not you agree with someone about wearing a mask, who cares? That is not the point.
It is still inappropriate to treat people that way, regardless of what you feel. To treat
people that way, and you're not going to be effective anyway.
Yeah.
Right? That's not the way to win an argument if that's what you're trying to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, unfortunately, Dr. Ponesse, we are running out of time here. But I just want to thank you so much for the position that you have voluntarily put yourself in. I want to thank you for your example and for your bravery, and for being a voice in the dark for people who need someone to look to. What you have chosen to take on is incredible, and it's very, very important. And I want to honor you for that, because not everyone would choose to do that. So thank you.
That's really lovely. And thank you for doing what you're doing. We wouldn't have conversations like this if it weren't for people like you with podcasts and trying to get these conversations going. So thank you.
Well, we're happy to be here. We're hopefully, we're just trying to be a part of the solution, I guess, is what I'm saying. But yeah, thanks for being here, and we'll see everybody next time.
Thank you for listening to The Canadian Story. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at The CAD Story. That's The CAD Story. If you enjoy this podcast, please share it with your friends and family. Let's work together to remind Canadians how great their country is.